we're going to start out talking about critical race theory. And we'll look at that somewhat briefly. It's a pretty short piece, right? It was a pretty short article for this week. So we'll take a look at that briefly, and then we'll start preparing for your next article, and we're going to go through some concepts and terms beforehand. And so that'll be the last thing we cover in class. The last two things we're going to cover in class is critical race theory and then post-colonialism. Post-colonial thought, which both of these are things that are becoming really common. Critical race theory is becoming really common in academia. Post-colonialism is all over the place. So it not only has a major effect within sociology, but post-colonialism is an important theory for literature. It's an important theory for anthropology, for political science, all kinds of things. Art criticism, if you're into art, anything like that. Okay, so let's get into critical race theory. They may catch what discipline critical race theory comes out of. So our article that we're looking at specifically is, so what's critical about critical race theory by Trevino. So did anybody catch what discipline critical race theory comes out of? It's very different from most of the stuff we've looked at. What does it talk a lot about? You can just guess. Anybody want to guess? I'll tell you, I'll point you guys to a paragraph. Okay, let's, so page 8. So, to begin with, you see that paragraph? Starts with to begin with. Volunteer to read. Go ahead.
To begin with, we admonish critical race theory legal scholars to examine self-reflexively their own deep cultural commitment to the rule of law. Thus far, they have largely failed to recognize, or more inexcusably, they have failed to admit the critical race theory's central tenet of addressing the issue of racism through law is inextricably tied to the ontology of law's rule.
Okay, I'm going to make you pause. What discipline do you think it comes out of?
Law.
Yeah. So critical race theory starts out in law. So our article is sort of an introduction to a special issue within a legal studies journal, right? That's going to cover a bunch of articles on critical race theory. And it's a combination of explaining what critical race theory is, but also like providing a bunch of critiques. So critical race theory grows out of the law. And we've actually seen, so it's going to focus on a couple of things. It's going to focus on the way in which law is structured in a way that continues race or continues racial inequality. So critical race theory is not going to, and that's actually going to be the criticism of our author, it's not going to be interested in things like how law is enforced. It's not going to be interested in things like how our culture surrounding that law, right? None of that, right? So like what they're really going to be interested is in the way in which law is often structured to reinforce racism. We kind of saw an example of that last week. You guys remember me pointing out that idea of like often we put racial biases into what we codify into law? Do you remember talking about that? I gave the example of crack versus cocaine, right? That's essentially a critical race theory kind of argument. So the idea of critical race theory is basically that the law has, in a quiet way, been constructed, or even incidentally been constructed to reinforce racial inequality. And it's going to focus a lot on people's subjective experiences of law. So it's going to give a lot of, and this kind of sort of cuts through it, critical race theory often takes a lot of things like victim narratives from within law. So analyzing, right, how people experience the legal structure when they're inside of it or a part of it. So that's critical race theory's main bent. What they do within that often is very different. So if we jump forward a little, I'm going to point you guys to page 9. And so this becomes like, in some ways, critical race theory is really influential, but it's also kind of hard to talk about because it's not a very unified system. We're going to see kind of how that's being talked about here. So, and we're going to pull out some major themes, and then I'll try to explain them a little more. So on page 9, the second paragraph where it says CRT. And whoever wants to jump in and start reading aloud, go ahead and do it.
CRT has many rigorous concepts and methods, but these have not been coherently integrated in a way that would give CRT the systematic structure, the intellectual architecture that is representative and, in fact, required of most social theory. What we frequently get with CRT is not a unified theory, but a loose hodgepodge of analytic tools that are frequently used in a catch-as-catch-can manner. Additionally, while CRT does possess several basic tenets or theses, the normality of racism thesis, the social construction thesis, the differential racialization thesis, the voice of color thesis, these do not constitute a fundamental set of beliefs on which all critics agree. Because of these two related issues of architecture and fundamentalism, we contend that CRT is rather less a theory than it is an intellectual movement in thought and work about race.
Okay, so what's our author saying about critical race theory here? This is going to make critical race theory really different from things that we've looked at in the past.
It doesn't have a unification source.
Yeah, it's not essential. It doesn't have a theoretical framework per se. So like, if we think about like almost everything we've studied in here has some sort of basic theoretical framework. So like we read Franz Fanon. A good example, when we read Franz Fanon, right? Franz Fanon had a theory. His theory was about the way in which black people formulated consciousness on the basis of their experiences of consuming white media, right? That one overarching theory has all sorts of implications. People have used it in all sorts of different ways, but it's one structure. There's one like kind of point to it. Critical race theory, the difficult thing in talking about it is that there isn't just one idea that's a part of critical race theory, but instead it was a movement that happened within legal studies. So when people, essentially the ways of interpreting the law sort of shifted in a way that was centered around race, but what people found when they did that is often very different from one another. So it lists off some concepts that come out of critical race theory or theses, and that's what we're going to use as a basis to kind of analyze it. So, what was that list? It was right after the EG. There's a few things.
The normality of racism thesis.
Let's start there. Normality of racism. Okay. Anyone want to? What do we mean when we say? What does the word normality mean?
Commonplace.
Yeah. Commonplace. What else? If something's normal, what don't you think about it? Or what don't you do? Did anybody have a normal morning this morning? I had a pretty normal morning. Followed my regular routine for Tuesday, Thursday. You know, I got up at 5 in the morning, started drinking my coffee, looked over my articles. You know, I do that occasionally, shutting off lights to look out over the park because I can't see outside my window because it's dark out unless the lights are on. And I like to relax in a relaxed manner, look at the stars and the trees and the wind blowing, right? I did this and I do it every morning, right? Like, if my alarm didn't go off and I ended up waking up at 7 o'clock rather than 5, I would notice that. I didn't necessarily notice my morning, it just kind of happened, right? That's kind of the point, the feeling of normalcy that they're trying to get at. That it's commonplace in a way that we're often unaware of it. Racism in our system becomes normal. That's one of the central that's one of the central ideas, or one of the theses that's very common in critical race theory. And that's to some degree like talking about this is why the law ends up being structured in a way that represents a white worldview, is because we don't think it does, right? There's just a normalcy to racially biased law. That we're all kind of used to it, we don't really think of it as working any other way. So it's really hard for us to sort of step outside of it, right? So another way to think of it is like, us going about our day-to-day lives reinforces racism, because racism is just kind of a part of the structure, so we have a tendency to notice it, right? It has a normalcy to it. Any questions or thoughts on the normalcy of racism? Is it pretty clear? You guys? Okay, cool. What's the next thesis on the list?
The social construction thesis.
Yeah, social construction thesis. Okay, so we should partially be familiar with the idea of race being a social construction by this point, right? So we've looked at other theories that have a very similar underpinning to it. You can think about where we started with the idea of race growing out of colonialism, right? This is a social constructionist argument, right? That race is a social construct. Within critical race theory, they have a specific theory of racial construction. And this has to do with the idea of the color line. Has anybody ever heard this term before, the color line? This is somewhat common. No? So often in critical race theory, they have sort of this idea that we have to understand different racialized categories, regardless of what race we're talking about, is being coded as black or white. And this line, right, that divides it is not something that's actually set in stone, but it's something that moves. So our racialization of the world around us is fluid, right? In this moving line between what we code as black and what we code as white. This has to do with people, but it also has to do with even things, pieces of culture, right? How we code them. The color line moves, right? So what might be an example if we're thinking about a racial category that is sometimes black and sometimes not? What might be an example? What might that mean? What groups of people, either historically or currently, are coded as being, and this is like, basically, if we want to take it like black, this context means that that people are racial minorities. So it doesn't necessarily, in critical race theory, mean specifically African Americans, right? But it uses black more as a catch-all term. And it's not to like lump it together, it's to get the idea of like, basically that and this will be a term we look at a little bit more, the otherizing, right, of black people is tied up with the otherizing of other racial groups. So they refer to that as essentially being coded as black. What may be an example of a group that is coded as black?
With gangs?
Yeah, you could think about, yeah, so like we have a tendency to racialize gangs, right? Are there white street gangs? Are there Latino street gangs? Are there, right? But our conception of them is as black, so it becomes coded as black. That's a good example, yeah. What else? What are the groups of people? What other minority groups do we have in the United States? Racial minority groups. Yeah.
Hispanic, Native American, Asian American.
Yeah, okay, so let's take as an example Hispanic. Where are Hispanics in this dichotomy? And this is actually getting to the point of the color line. It's both, right? So the color line moves. So at one moment, the same group of people could be coded as white and coded as black, right? It might depend on the activities, it might depend on your social class, right? But the color line moves. Also, currently, who's being coded as a racial minority may not in the future be treated as one. And so, like, you think about things like, if you were to take, in the past, like if we were to go back a couple hundred years, different groups of people would have been racialized. You know, so like in the United States, we no longer racialize, I don't know, the Irish, right? But if you go back in time, like in England and in the United States, like the Irish are highly racialized. They're thought of as being biologically determined and having bad behavior sets, right? Their biology makes them drunks and angry, right? This is a stereotype. This is a stereotype that existed for a long time, and it is essentially the racialization of the Irish. So like within critical race theory, they want us to understand that like this line isn't set in stone. Another debate, you hear people talk about Asian Americans and whether people of Asian descent are increasingly being coded as white rather than being coded as black. If we were to go back in the past, that's not true, right? Now you have a tendency to view it that way. Or we can take another racial minority. There's still some anti-Semitism, but I think the anti-Semitism is probably on the decline, right? Part of that is would have you 70 years ago called somebody who's Jewish white? 70 years ago, probably not, right? They're not Anglo-Saxons. They're not, right? Like you would have called them Semitics, you know. But today, people who are Jewish descent are not thought of as minorities, right? Or another good example, we've gotten really uncomfortable, so it can go the other way too. We've gotten really uncomfortable with people from the Middle East in the United States, right? But if you were to go back not that long ago, people were more willing to sometimes have portrayals of Arab Americans that are somewhat white. So like a good example of this, has anybody ever watched, there was a TV show from the 70s called MASH. Has people seen this show ever? It's like they constantly play it on TV. One of the major characters in MASH is Lebanese, but they just treat him as a white guy, right? They don't make big deal about his racialized category, and they don't treat him specifically as being black, right? You would not get the same portrayal of an Arab American in the United States. Like if you have an Arab American on television, it's a big deal that they're Arab American. It becomes a central part of their character, right? So it's treating it as a racial minority. So the point is that for critical race theory, what they want us to be aware of is not only is race a social construction, but it's also an exceptionally fluid line that moves around. What determines who we label as black or white is mainly going to be what's beneficial, right? What's beneficial for the existing system? So it's not going to be on the basis of what's beneficial for minorities, but it's going to be on the basis of what's beneficial for the existing system and existing power structures, according to critical race theory. So like the fact that we, formerly Arab Americans might have occasionally been coded as white, or people were more willing to look at them as if they were white. Now that they're thought of more in terms of black in a racialized category, this didn't happen because white people got together and decided they were going to be, like, essentially it happened too because, right, within larger political context, the existing system is benefited by, right, existing power relations is benefited by coding them negatively. Same thing with the inclusion of Asian Americans didn't happen because white people decided they were going to be nicer to Asian Americans, right? But it happened because as Asian Americans moved up in power and wealth, they moved into, right, the predominant class, so that they're included, right? It's because their inclusion is economically beneficial to white people is the reason why they're included. That's kind of the claim here. Make sense? Okay. So that's our second major thesis coming out of critical race theory. The next one's kind of tied to that. So what's the next one on that list? I'll let Kaylee do
The
it.
differential racialization.
Yeah, differential racialization. So not only are people coded as white and black, but there's somewhat of a differential in how people are coded that way, right? So like it's not a set category. In other words, like people can be thought of as more black or more white is a big part of their system. So like the idea is like, this goes back to like the idea that like Hispanics are coded as more white than African Americans in the United States. They're more likely to be treated occasionally as white, right? But they maybe aren't as white as white people, right? You guys get kind of the image here? So the idea is that we can take racialized categories and to some degree rank them in terms of how well they're treated within our system, where they fall within that hierarchy. So that there's a differential happening, right? That it's not a yes or no answer. Okay, and that's it. Those two are pretty tied together. What's the last thesis? And this is actually a major thesis that's in other areas of race studies that we've seen before. What's the last one?
Voice of color thesis?
Yeah, the voice of color thesis. So getting back to like the idea that people, African Americans are voiceless in the United States on some level. We saw that pop up a lot with Patricia Hill Collins, right? This is a big tenet of critical race theory. Okay. So any questions about any of these four theses? Or thoughts, people? So yeah, taken together, these are things that, and critical race theory, just to sort of temporalize it, it's been happening since the 1990s and early 2000s. It's become pretty, there's a lot of scholarship being done on that. So. Okay. If there's no other questions, we'll plunge forward and keep on moving on. Okay, great. So the last thing we're going to talk about today, well, don't get excited because there's quite a few pieces to it, but is post-colonial theory. So there's three major figures in post-colonial theory. I'll kind of go through them. We talked about one of these briefly very early in the semester, which is the founder of post-colonialism, which is Edward Said. So, Edward Said, the major concepts we should get out of Edward Said is alterity, the other, and the Occidental Oriental divide. Sometimes post-colonialism is also referred to as Orientalism, which gets a little confusing because it's an older term that they somewhat appropriate. So I'm going to start here. So to understand kind of the context, we use the word Orient differently in the U.S. Than other countries. What do we mean when we say the word Orient? Which, by the way, like Orient is somewhat of a racist term today, right? That's partially why it's being used here. We'll see. So what do Americans generally mean if they use the word Orient or Oriental?
To refer to Asia?
Yeah, we refer to mostly Southeast Asia. There's a broader context, and there used to be something called Oriental Studies. It used to be a subdiscipline within academia. Oriental Studies studied Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Right? So we're thinking about the sort of like large swath of colonized space in a lot of ways. So within post-colonialism, when you see this word Oriental, generally what they're going to mean by that is they're just going to mean basically anything that's colonized, right? Anything that was a part of that initial push of colonization we talked about. Okay, Occidental. Occidental is essentially the West, right? So it's this. And so what Said wants to be like is he wants to be like the Orient as we understand it. It doesn't actually exist. The Orient is just a creation of the Occident. In other words, what we say and think about other places, according to Edward Said, has nothing to do with what those places are. So a good way to think about this is, if I say something like, we could do like a word association. If I was to say the word Africa and you just told me the first image that popped into your head, what sort of things would you think of? I know nobody wants to answer this question because it's actually probably telling what pops into your head. But if I say the word Africa, what pops into your head?
Lions.
What's that?
Lions.
Lions. Some sort of wild animals, right? Okay. What other images did people pop into people's heads? I know this is an uncomfortable exercise. I'm aware of this.
Like a lot of culture and community and dancing.
Yeah, that's a good community and culture. So you think about like basically people having in a lot of ways like closer communities. Is that kind of your image? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So we'll take that. What else what else pops into your head? What else? Anything else? Anybody have anything negative pop into their head?
Like groups in Africa that I guess terrorist groups in Africa that or others that cause civil wars and stuff like that in countries.
Yeah. war, terrorism. What else?
Poverty.
Poverty. A lot of people think of disease when they think of Africa, right? The point is this. If we were to take other parts of the world, what you automatically understand about that part of the world has more to do with what is said here than what exists here, right? So all those images in our head that we use to reduce other places, they're actually an invention of our own discourse, is the claim here. So Said wants to claim that this is usually paired between both positive and negative portrayals, right? So like the Orient is a place of fantasy, right? And it's also a place that we're afraid of fear. And so both are kind of true, right? So we have an idealized version of Africa that pops into people's heads. This may be like that kind of like, you know, communalism of the village, right? And then you can hear this in like phrases like, we have sort of like, English is great for colloquialisms. Did anybody aware that you use more colloquialisms in English than you do in other languages? Like, English is a language of random pictures. It makes it really hard for other people to learn. But anyways, like you have like phrases like, it takes a village to raise a child, right? That phrase, right, has a certain connotation of it that is actually kind of supposed to, it's like an indication of this sort of positive Orientalist fantasy of these sort of like perfectly communal places, right? That is one version of Orientalism. The other version of Orientalism is that it's this scary place of poverty and disease and war, right? Even though is everyone in Africa poor? No, there's huge class differences within Africa, right? There's huge differences between the countries, too. Different countries have different degrees of wealth. There's huge differences within that, and essentially our discourse sort of whitewashes over it, right? But this is actually the most important point that Said's trying to make, is that what really makes this distinction important is who gets to speak about what Africa is? Who gets to decide? And we can do this with any other region of the world. Who decides what Africa's like? In our discourse, and what we say about it. Who gets to paint an image? Who predominantly creates culture that's consumed worldwide? Who writes most of the stories that you watch on television? Where does all this stuff come from?
From the West.
It comes from the West, right? And it comes from specific groups of people within the West who have a larger voice than others, right? A good example of this is if you start watching like TV shows, like there's sort of been like this string of, and I think this is really fascinating. There's been this string of sort of like feminist programming that is like empowerment of women's stories. This is particularly true of like online streaming shows, right? If you guys haven't noticed this, if you start paying attention, most of them are written by men. That's fascinating, right? And that's kind of the idea is most culture is actually created by hegemonic groups, right? Most of our culture is created by hegemonic groups, which means that the Orient doesn't get to tell its own story, right? So that's Said's major point. It doesn't get to tell its own story. Instead, it gets talked about. And this is this process of it being talked about is what he means by Orientalism, right? Orientalization, right? When a place becomes talked about, right? And so essentially because because, and this is his point, because our image of these places is just the West speaking to itself, right? It's more important the way in which it serves as an other, right? The way in which it serves as, and this is where we came across this term when we were talking about Hertog very early in the semester. He uses this term other as well. And this term other, yeah, basically is a way of saying that the West talks about the Orient, and it serves as this sort of grounding point for it understanding itself. That's really the function of it. So there is no Orient. There's just the West speaking to itself. Right? And we could say that, like, across history, right? And this is Said's point. If we think about the history of how the Middle East is talked about, Africa is talked about, Asia is talked about, the portrayal changes, but that change is based upon changes in how the Occident likes to view itself, right? So basically what we're seeing is this sort of migrating discourse, but what's common across all of it is that the Orient isn't really present. So in a lot of ways, for Said, what he wants to claim is that it's being talked about. That is a little bit of the center of what reinforces racism and cultural differences between places over time. Right? So cultural superiority is maintained by being able to be the one speaking. Right? You get to determine what everybody else in the world is. And so this is really like, for Said, this is really the power behind the West. So the power is not, like before when we've looked at colonialism, this is significant because as we moved from colonialism into what you could call the post-colonial, right? We no longer are necessarily debatably, but if we're looking at the world through Said's lens, we're no longer like so much invading other countries with large groups of soldiers and then holding it and maintaining it forever as a colony, right? But the power behind the differences between groups of people is instead through these sort of cultural things, right? So the culture of colonialism for Said has a lot of continuity and is still around, right? Even though colonialism itself has been ended for a very long time. So within the post-colonial, power is mostly a cultural power. And so understanding those mechanisms, right, is really significant. All that makes sense? Any thoughts or questions people have on this idea? Going back to like this right here is maybe, this and the two ideas we're going to talk about after, these are maybe the most common ideas we've looked at all semester in terms of academia. They're very, you've heard this before. What class did you learn it in? I'm just curious.
Well, just like in general, just kind of, just the idea of it all.
Yeah. I just wondered if there was a specific class you had in mind, like some literature class or something.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Said was a lit person, so we use him in sociology, but he mainly came up with this thesis by analyzing poetry. So this is where this idea originally came from. In sociology, we use it more generally and for other things that aren't necessarily literature, but this idea of orientalizing people, constructing that other, right, is pretty significant. Any questions or thoughts? Is this something, so you've heard this, but is this something other people have heard before? Is this a new idea? This is a new idea for some of you guys, not for others? Okay, so that's our first. So Said's the first post-colonialist. He kind of kicks everything off. And then there's been two major changes since then. So this is in the late 70s. In the 1980s, somebody else became very popular, somebody by the name of Spivak. Also significant, to somewhat significantly, a lot of these voices are actually people who are from other places in the world. So Said is, he's an Arab who lives in Israel. So that's sort of his backstory. Spivak is from Bangladesh, so she's Bangladeshi. And so Spivak, her major contribution to post-colonialism is this idea of the subaltern. And in particular, she wrote a piece called Can the Subaltern Speak? And so, has anyone ever heard this term subaltern before? Ever heard this before? So subaltern is a broad term that's used in academia to describe anyone who's voiceless. If somebody is voiceless, they are a subaltern, right? So this quality of being voiceless. And so what Spivak actually has in mind here is, so for Said, it's sort of like what determines whether you're an other, what determines your alterity, is whether or not you live in one place or the other, right? So like, if you live in, if you are an Orient, essentially like if you live in the Orient, if you are Orientalized, then you are another, you have alterity. For Spivak, she wants to claim that the voicelessness of people is not so cut and dry as Said pictures it, but instead that within countries, there's a combination of elites and non-elites. And elites within countries become the thing talked about. The subaltern is generally groups of people that are categorized by us never recognizing their existence to begin with. So denying the existence to some degree of groups of people. That's her claim. So his quality of being subaltern is to some degree being so low in the hierarchy that when we talk about people's needs or when we portray a place, they're just not even present. So a good example of kind of like Spivak's philosophy, there was, I can't remember the name of the sketch comedy. I used to have, so I rotate through streaming services. Does anyone else do this to save money? So I'll get one, I'll run it for a couple of months, I'll binge watch everything on it, and then I'll move to another, and I just do this, so I hit everything about once every 2 years, right? And am I the only person who does this? Anyways, so I remember when I had HBO, there was this sketch comedy. It was put together by a group of African American women. Has anyone seen this? I don't know the name of that. Has people seen this show before? It was only on for like one season, I think. Or at least maybe it was new when I watched it. Since I don't have HBO, I can't just like go back and find it. But anyway, so there's this joke where one of the reoccurring skits was there's this woman who was an overweight African American woman, and she was the perfect spy because nobody ever recognized her in the room. Nobody ever saw her. So she would essentially go around and she would just be ignored everywhere she went. So because of that, she basically became like invisible. It was like camouflage. And so there's this running joke about this, right? That's essentially kind of Spivak's image here, is that certain groups of people, like it's like they're sheerly invisible. Of course, like that's making a joke about something that's meant to be actually like very cutting in the way that they're telling the joke, right? That essentially like we often treat people as if they're unimportant and invisible. Right, and that actually, it's not, rather than a superpower, it's actually like something harmful. And that's kind of Spivak's point. Spivak's point is that within a country, there are populations. So like on one level, and so this works in like levels, right? So Orientalism makes it so that like if you think about a place like India, what pops into your head, all of that is alterity. But it's not all equally forms of alterity, because within India, there are elites and non-elites, and when you think of India, you're actually thinking of elite groups, not non-elites, which reinforces this sort of non-existence of them culturally, right? So you aren't necessarily thinking of like minority groups that exist within India, right? Instead, you're thinking about sort of like, if you will, what's hegemonic within India, right? Same thing as like, when you think about China, you don't think about Chinese Muslims in the Northern Territories. Like, that's not what's popping into your head. Somebody did their paper on a group of people, on that group of people. But anyways, the example is what pops in your head is not that group of people. Those people are subalterns within that system, right? All of those attitudes are to some degree reinforcing power, but they don't have an equal effect. Make sense? So that's Spivak's main contribution, is this idea of subaltern. If you go on in college long enough in the social science and humanities, you'll come across this term all over the place. Actually, probably at least 5 of our articles have used this term already. We just haven't talked about it. So it's a very common idea. Spivak is extremely influential. Okay, so the most recent turn in post-colonialism is a movement towards something called hybridity, which is different from when we looked at it. We looked at that hybridity in scientific racism, so don't get this crossed, it's meaning it differently. Which is an idea by somebody named Homi Bhabha. And so Bhabha is interesting. There's 2 B's in here. Oh, there we go. Wait, no, it's 2 H's. There. Homi Bhabha. And so Bhabha is, what Bhabha's really interested in is he wants to be like, this is a great, like to some degree, Bhabha wants to be like, this is a great way of understanding how the hegemon acts towards other people. But what Bhabha is actually interested in is he's interested in how is it that we could see other, like groups of people in the Orient, rather than just sort of complacent, is utilizing, right, Orientalism in a variety of ways to assert themselves. In other words, like they're not just, so for Bhabha he wants to be like, even the subaltern, they're not just passive in their construction, right? And this is very similar to like some of the turns we've taken in this class as well, right? So we think about like African Americans as a group of people in the United States, right? They are not just passive recipients of racist ideology, right? But they are actively acting against it in a variety of ways. This is where we got to a social movement. Same turn happens with Homi Bhabha. So for Homi Bhabha, he wants to basically be like, our sort of racialized Orientalist understandings of people in other parts of the world, people don't just act like passively embrace those and say whatever, right? But they actually take part in them in a variety of ways that undercuts them. And he refers to this process as hybridity. That if we get into the space of hybridity, what he calls the borderland, what he calls the borderland, the space of hybridity. This is the space in which Orientalist ideologies break down. So, in other words, what Homi Bhabha wants to claim is if we actually are forced into an interaction with other people, those people don't, because they don't exist in the Orientalist frame, right? Because whatever we say about them isn't who they are, their sheer existence automatically challenges the ideology. So in other words, like getting to know people, right, creates this sort of challenge to existing racialized structures, right? So this moment of hybridity, the borderland, where people actually interact, is this moment where it's contended, it breaks down. And that's because like you can think about, so like if we were to take sort of like a classic example, right? So if we were to go back to Said talking about this idea of the Oriental-Occidental divide, one of the major themes, the theme we've seen before, is that often the West likes to present us with an image of the rest of the world as savages, right? And what are savages? Well, if you read any sort of like racist literature from the past, right, savages are presented as people who have no culture, right, are extremely violent, who leaders are despots over them, right, who are highly sexualized, right, who are amoral, who are backwards. Because that person, the savage, is not real. It's just a construct of the West, because this is the story the West like to tell about itself, as being the opposite of that. If you actually get to know people in the space of hybridity in the borderland, right, it breaks down, because those people don't exist. So you can think about, like, if you were to take an cultural anthropology class, right, the difference between this sort of 19th century understanding of the savage and what people in other countries are actually like is hugely different, right? Other cultures are very complex cultures, right? Filled with complex symbolism, right? Filled with difficult to understand connections and how people relate to one another, right? So they actually have a very complex culture. You know, other parts of the world, like other systems, are actually less violent than modernity, not more. So like if you were to go and do studies of sort of like, you know, tribal systems in sub-Saharan Africa, they're less violent than what exists in modernity. You know, there's actually a whole literature on this, like this idea of like war used to be nothing but sort of like, in a lot of ways, like sport. Like people didn't die in wars a lot of the time if you go back far enough, or if you go to certain geographic locations where the society is small enough, right? The point is like that doesn't jive with this sort of idea of these violent savages constantly killing one another. It's not really the system that existed, right? So if you get to know people within the borderland, like it doesn't mean that people are unilaterally positive, but they're not what the Orient paints them as. Or sorry, they're not what the Occident paints them as in Orientalism, right? So it's an automatic challenge. And in some ways, like, the real physical existence of people is a challenge to the ideology. That's Homi Bhabha's point. That people will never be able to be boxed into what we say about them. And so the same thing could be, like, we could talk about, and I think, like, you know, because the United States in some degree is itself a colony, like, we could think about race in the United States through much the same frame, right? So in the United States, Western hegemony creates a certain dialogue about what African Americans are like. That African American that we talk about doesn't exist. So our stereotypes about African Americans being overly violent or overly sexist, or any of those stereotypes that we've talked about as we've looked at different literature, those people don't exist, right? And so within Bhabha's world, it's in the space of hybridity. It's in that point where you actually get to know people, that you realize, right, that what you've heard is false. And there's a power to that. So basically what he wants to get us into is this space of tension, right, that breaks down sort of the moral superiority of the hegemon, right, who feels like it has, like in the way in which it presents or portrays minorities, right, it sort of feels like it has the ability to run roughshod over them to make themselves, in their own minds, look better. You guys see how all this works? Okay, cool. So these are the basic concepts for post-colonialism. Now, for next week, you're going to have a reading that's an example. It's a contemporary example of somebody writing in a post-colonial. I haven't actually read the article yet, so I'll read it along with you this week, and then we'll talk about it. But I can guarantee you that a lot of these concepts will be running through it, right? So like this is the basic framework that our author's working in, And what we'll see is we'll see them applying this framework to something specific next week. Okay, any questions for me, thoughts, things people have before we close out for the day? Ending a little early today. Okay, great. Remember presentations on Thursday. So.